What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, and today on the podcast, returning is the dynamic theological duo of Grace G. Sun Kim and Susan Shaw. They co-authored a brand new book, Surviving God, a new vision of God through the eyes of sexual abuse survivors. And in this conversation, we dig into it, reflect on the nature of thinking theologically, in intersectional ways through the experience of people who've experienced deep abuse, shame, and harm. And we also talk about what it's like to have a theological tag team partner like Grace and Susan have in each other. We don't just, this is like their second book together, and we already heard, you're going to hear, that they have a third coming out. So buckle the theological safety belt. Now, before we jump in, two things, my dear friends. Number one, this June, we're going to be having an open online class here at Homebrewed, Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us. My friend Diana Butler-Bass and Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals are partnering with me on this class, and we are going to be exploring alternatives. That's right, alternatives to the ugly public theologies of the present. And we're going to be joined by a number of different scholars. Reggie Williams, Kevin Carnahan, Julie Ingersoll, Jennifer Harvey, Jonathan Wilson Hartgroves, and Robert P. Jones, all are going to be a part of this class. You can join it up. Donate anything you want between $0 and $1 million at faithandpolitics.net. And last, if you enjoy hanging out with Grace in this episode, then come hang out with us in person at Theology Beer Camp. That's right. Go to theologybeer.camp and you can come hang out this October in Denver, Colorado with me, with Grace, Diana, Brian McLaren, John Tatamino, Ilya Dilio, Adam Clark, York Rieger, Gary Dorian, Leah Robinson, Christy Whaley, Tom Ord. Come on, it's going to be off the chain. And guess who else is coming? Catherine Keller. That's not even on the website yet. Anyway, if you go to theologybeer.camp, you can join up. Get your ticket now. The ticket price goes up June 1st. So, you want to go ahead and grab it. All right? Anyway, here we go. Grace and Susan, enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am joined, not one, but two of my favorite nerds, Grace G. Sun Kim and Susan Shaw, who have tag teamed again for a new book, Surviving God. And I'm quite excited to get to talk to you both. And just let you know, I think that as a team, y'all are quite the dynamic duo.
You are too kind, Trip. Thank you so much for thinking that way. I really appreciate it. It's a joy to work with Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Trip. I love working with Grace, and I also love being a nerd, so this is perfect for me.
Well, the new book, Surviving God, in many ways is kind of like doing the intersectional contextual theology that y'all developed in your last book. So maybe I'll ask Susan the first question. Like, can you kind of draw the connections between where you ended up and how the origin story for this book developed?
Yeah, no, you've got it spot on. We wrote Intersectional Theology. It really is a sort of theological method book. And so what we were trying to do was to show people how we could draw from the idea of intersectionality, which really originated in, women, gender, ethnic studies, and focuses on sort of how we have to think about gender, race, class, sexuality, age, ability, all those things, all at the same time within context of social structures and institutional power. And so we ask those kinds of questions of the Bible and theology, and so try to complicate how people think about theology. So then Grace and I thought about, how would we do this ourselves? What would be a topic? And this was about the time that Me Too and Church Too were taking off. And we thought, oh my gosh, what a place to apply this method And so we thought about the issue of gender violence, and then we really narrowed it down to sexual abuse, because as survivors, both of us could talk from that place to do this work, and we could invite others to join with us in that conversation. And so that's sort of how this emerged as the topic for this book.
Mm-hmm. So Grace, that kind of cooperative process there and finding a connection point, not just in your kind of shared intellectual interests, but a shared experience as survivors. Was there a different tonality, even for someone like yourself who is regularly vulnerable in their text, to have to bring that vulnerability out in the writing process, in the discovery and reflection process with a writing partner?
Yeah, so, writing, Trip, you've co-authored too, so congratulations on your new book, Deconstructing Christianity, I believe. So congratulations. So you know how it can be difficult or it can be great co-writing. And for those who haven't co-written, it's not an easy process, but I think if you find the right friend to write it with, then because then it becomes a learning experience. And because of this topic, we both become very vulnerable. And in that way, it becomes a journey, and we can support and learn from one another. So, as our first book that Susan just talked about, Intersectional Theology, understanding that our identities are, multi-identities. It's not just one, I'm not one-dimensional, but multidimensional, and understanding that even this sexual violence against women and also men, there's so many variants and so many things that are happening. So we want to look at, theology, look at Bible, look at church, look at context, look at our own situation. So it became a great writing experience. It was not a time like, oh, I'm going to give up. And, I'm certain that there are co-authors or co-editors that feel like that, because I'm sure, Trip, you and I may have, or Susan. But I think with Susan, we're so different, but we're also similar in different ways. But it becomes a very, a learning experience in the vulnerable spaces. And this book was not easy to write. The topic is difficult. And if you asked me even 5 years ago, Trip, if we're going to write on something like this, I wouldn't have ever said that we're going to, because I never wanted to write on this. But as we were discussing, we just thought it was the right one for our second book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Susan, y'all have like quite the zinger of a first line in the first chapter. The God of our childhoods was terrifying. Now, we share a similar background as Baptists from the South, and Grace has shared quite a bit about her background previously on the podcast. But I'd love for you to give a bit about your context that listeners may be less familiar with, on what it's like, not just for that God being terrifying, but coming to grips with it, right? Part of what y'all do in the book is risking taking your own experience and the experience of other survivors so seriously that on behalf of that reality, wrestling with the inherited concepts of God.
Yeah, well, I grew up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist in North Georgia. And so the God I knew was a God who was absolutely in control of everything. And so whatever happened was somehow in the will of God. And so for me, what that meant was that somehow whatever was happening to me was God's will. And if it was something wrong, then I needed to fix it, because, we had all this individual responsibility. And so I remember feeling quite responsible for stopping my abuse. And I was a kid. I mean, I was like 11 years old when this started. And I would pray for forgiveness for my own abuse, because I felt responsible that I didn't stop it. And within God's will, that could happen because God had a perfect will and a permissive will. And in God's permissive will, we had human choice that could go against what God wanted in God's perfect will. So I lived with that for a long time, and with the guilt that came with it and the shame and all those sorts of things, because I didn't know what else to do with it. And I remember I reached this point where I thought, wait a minute, what kind of God would allow these things to happen to a child? And do I really want anything to do with that God? And it was at seminary, a Southern Baptist seminary, which happened to be quite moderate at the time, where I was able to ask that question. And I didn't know what to do with it. And this is where, as we've talked about in an earlier podcast, thankfully I came across process theology. And that's what kept me Christian. I was on my way out the door. And what process theology says is God is not coercive power, but persuasive love, that God can only do what God can do, and that is not unlimited. And so God could not have stopped the suffering, neither did God will it, because God is calling all things to fulfill their divine aim, which is enjoyment. And so what that meant was that God, who is also present in every particle of the universe, was present in my suffering and experienced my suffering. And God's suffered with my suffering. And at that point, that was enough to keep me in Christianity and to begin seeking other ways. And then as I dug deeper, I realized that God not only was suffered in my suffering, but God also called for justice. And while I don't know that was ever achieved, it has left me with what Grace taught me, which is Han, this notion of the suffering that comes from unresolved injustice. And so I sort of live with that, that's just part of this now, and that gets resolved then through things like writing this book with Grace, which I think probably heals another piece of this, even though it's hard.
Yeah.
Grace, do you want to say a bit about like the use of that concept Han, both and something that I think that moves through the book is first, right, the experience of not just your own stories, but a multiplicity of survivors, and then what does that say about God's own experience? And so how do you see both the particularities of these stories and the affirmation of experience changing the way we relate to ourselves and also the way God relates to our own experience?
Yeah. So, I was born in Korea and I grew up in Canada, and, I spoke Korean at home, and I was really embarrassed to speak Korean outside the home. But, immigrants' parents couldn't speak English very well. They were just busy trying to survive. And I remember just being horrified whenever my parents came to see me at school or somewhere and they spoke in Korean. But looking back, I'm so grateful that my parents spoke in Korean, because now all that is really helping me understand myself and understand and develop theology. When I was studying my doctorate, I just thought, the white male European theologians are so bright, and what can I contribute? It really, I always felt like I'm not good enough, or my Korean culture is not good enough because of the racism, and people just look down on people of color in general. It doesn't matter if you're in the church or society or in school. So it took me a while to kind of retrieve some of my Korean culture, language, terms, and ideas. And, other Korean, American, Canadian theologians are doing the same. And I think that's what theologians have been doing all the last 2,000 years. It felt that I shouldn't be doing it because the white was the norm. The European male theology was the norm. So now to go to Han is a very common understanding in Korea, a very common term that we use. If you check Korean on the map, it's a tiny little peninsula bordering China, and across the water is Japan. So this tiny little peninsula has always been invaded either by Chinese or Japanese or other countries wanting this tiny piece of land. And, with war, invasion, and colonialism, we had to live under colonialism most recently under Japanese colonialism. You know how difficult it is. People are killed. People are taken as sexual slaves. You lose your identity, your language. All these horrific things happen to you, and we see that presently in other places around the world. So for this unjust system, this unjust suffering that people have gone through, Koreans, we have used the word Han to kind of convey the suffering that we are experiencing. So in the English language, when we use suffering is very wide. And, if I skip lunch, maybe you're suffering a bit because you're so hungry. But this Han is not that type of suffering. It is when there is an unjust system set in place to cause the suffering. So if you are living in a developing country and, the rich countries are taking your resources and you're skipping so many meals, that's Han. So here in the US, when the systems are set up to cause racism and sexism and other isms, then that is Han. So Han can be felt collectively or individually. And so it becomes a helpful term, concept for what is happening within Christianity, because so many times in Christianity, we have this vertical relationship, this personal piety. Oh, we have to be so good and pray and, do all the good things vertically with God that we forget the horizontal relationship. So Andrew Sung Park has a book, The Other Side of Sin. So he's talking about Han, and that is this sin that we commit against one another, our brothers and sisters, our other communities, that we forget to concentrate and focus on within Christianity. So Han, it's a small word, but it's a big concept, and it reminds us of all those things, to look at what we're doing to one another and looking at the other side of sin, and to break down this unjust systems that are set up.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that is quite well, I guess it's not anticipated when you pick up the book, are all the different vignettes from other people. This isn't just a book about surviving God and your own experiences is centered, but your own experience is centered in a way that you actually make space for multiple people's lives to get shared throughout. And I think that in many ways, that's a testimony to a kind of confidence. If we're thinking of the inherited, very normalizing Anglo theories of theology, that like one of the genuine sources for thinking about God is thinking about God with people in their own embodied experience. And there's the general risk as authors to put your own forward, but then there's a whole nother kind of risk to not just share someone else's story, but that it's part of a constructive proposal that you're making together. So, Susan, could you tell me about both like deciding to include all of these, and what was it like as the theologians providing the scaffolding for all these stories to take them seriously in a way that they're feeling honored and treasured when they read it, and not utilized? That's generally like a fear, it's easy to have when you start using other people's language.
Well, that's part of intersectional method, right? Is that we have to take each individual story seriously and recognize that each of us is is socially located in a different place, which means we have different views and different perspectives. So in intersectional theology, Grace and I said that we think theology should be, and we use the term kaleidoscopic, that it should be this ever-shifting terrain where our theologies are tentative at best. So we always hold them with the idea that we could be wrong, that at best they're partial, because they're only what I can understand. And so for us, it was essential to have other voices, because Grace and I can only come at this from our own social locations, our own places in the world. And so we needed to have these other voices. And of course, we recognize that there are, millions and millions more voices that also would have something to lend to these visions of God. And so what we have is really more of a sort of sampling of voices and possibilities. And so we hope that the book is an invitation to others to engage in the same kind of theologizing, because there's other stuff out there that would be of such value to us, to sort of think about theology from all of these various perspectives. And so I think that it's key to do this, that while we can't write from those perspectives because they're not our experiences, we must hear them because they add to our own experiences. And so we think that's an essential part of doing intersectional theology. And also, like you said, of honoring the voices of other survivors who equally have things to teach us about God.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the way you did it, it wasn't like writing for them, but writing towards them. Mm-hmm. That there's a multiplicity of stories that come up throughout, and you're not just holding yourselves accountable to the constructive work you did together, but the collective voices that are in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I so appreciated that people were willing to talk to us. And we talked to so many different people who contributed, and some are named, some are not. That was sort of up to right. them. And it taught me so much to do that. And I wish we'd had time that we could have just kept talking to survivors so that we could have expanded. But, at some point you have a deadline and you have to stop and write. But I'm so grateful for the people who were vulnerable enough and trusted us with their stories. I mean, that's an immense honor for somebody to trust you, particularly with these kinds of stories. And they trusted what we would do with them. And I'm so grateful for that.
Grace, I know that a lot of times when academics try to wrestle with topics like this, the temptation is either to reflect on institutions that permit this kind of violence or cover it up, be it like you think of church scandals or when we let lawyers dictate how something's going to play out, or let's think about protections and that you can do around like children and safety protocols and all that, and it can get in this kind of very institutionally framed. Or there's a host of books that have done real powerful exegesis in scripture, right, to point out that just as survivors' voices get silenced in the life of the churches and are ignored as a site of reflection, exist in scripture, but in not framing it that way, the particularities of different people's lives really kind of create a different, I don't know, like a soundscape of sorts for doing intersectional theology. What did you learn about thinking theologically by doing what you were talking about in the previous book, and avoiding the temptation to go, tell institutions what to do, or, just or go back to scripture, all of which have their place. But this was I don't know. It was like a dangerous kind of constructive theology.
Yeah, I think you can say it was a little dangerous. When I do theology, we can only come to know God from our own experiences. It's not the institutional experiences. It's not the church experience. And it's not going to be an experience for all time and all people. But I feel traditional theology, Western European theology, was much like that. So to do this different way of doing theology, coming from our own lives and not hiding, and we know other male theologians have done that, but they hide behind but we're going to just come forward and share our own stories and our experiences. It is very vulnerable, but I think it becomes very authentic. In intersectional theology, we were talking about theology as biography and biography as theology. So we can only come to know God through our personal experiences. And nobody's life is rosy 24/7. We have painful lives. Of course, some people experience way more extreme pain than others, but it's never this rosy path. But I think in the difficulties, if you are allowed to even reflect on it, I think our experiences, Susan and I are different. Our experiences are different, but I think for coming from those experiences of harm and pain, it wasn't easy. Trip, we've done many podcasts so far, and every podcast, it becomes difficult for me to talk about it because, it's not an easy thing to discuss, especially coming from our own experiences. As I said before, I never thought I'd be writing on this, but I think it's important because through our writing and gathering stories from others, we know how common it is, not just in society, but in our churches. It's very common. It's just that we don't want to tackle this problem. We brush it under the rug and we just kind of feel like, oh, it's not a big deal. And then we tend to blame the victim, whether they are these little girls, these young girls who can't even process it. So, I don't know. I have a hard time, but I think this is the way, for me at least, to do theology. And it's wonderful that Susan and I can do it together because it's such a difficult thing. But intersectionality, we're this multiplicity that it's not black and white. I'm always trying to move away from dualism. It's this multidimensional. It can be both and so we approach. We read scripture over again, some of these popular passages, and we want to rethink who God is in light of our experiences of pain and harm and suffering. So the book covers a lot. And, at the beginning when I was doing it, I didn't know where it was going to end up. And that's how I feel with every book that I write. I don't know. I've just started and we'll see where it goes. But Trip, I must say, it turned out really good. I wasn't sure how it was going to end up and how it was even going to conclude. But I'm really happy with it. I'm just thankful for Susan to be with me on this journey.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I'm real interested in is the kind of observations you would make about how the church fails to cultivate a healthy framing and conversation around sexuality. Because as you share bits of these stories and your own, it's easy if you've been in religious spaces to start filling in the dots behind it. And a lot of these stories, it's not just the actual violator that's culpable. It's a culture and a system in the way sex, our identities, our bodies are discussed, valued, and how those ideas get internalized within it. And I wonder, Susan, what kind of observations you have about the church's sex problems after after listening to these stories and then wrestling with them, because and people listen to our previous interview, that's something you spent time doing early on in your own work as well, and obviously teaching in a gender studies program, you're going to hear these stories. So if people that are in leadership in faith spaces wanted to like not suck at even like just the background framing of discussing God and sex at the same time. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good book title, I must say, before Susan begins. It's a good book title.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, the church doesn't talk about sex, so there's one problem. And when they do, it's not very well usually. And I think I find myself actually through this thinking, thank God I'm old enough I didn't have to go through purity culture. I mean, that just makes everything worse. I mean, the poor people who grew up a couple generations after me with purity culture, I mean, it was hinted at the ways I grew up. So when sex was talked about, it was basically don't. And the responsibility, of course, is much more on the girls to learn to say no, because, of course, boys just have this drive they can't overcome, which if I were a man, I'd find that quite insulting, that I'm so weak-willed I can't overcome my sex drive. But, so that was kind of it. Just don't. And then purity culture comes along and really sort of develops all that into this sort of, girls and women are responsible for men's sexuality. And, if a man is tempted, it's because some woman tempted him, and they, can go back and it's all Eve's fault. And as I heard somebody say, that's a long time to hold a grudge. But, it's a really bad reading of the story of Eve anyway. And so I think folks who've been in purity culture have really struggled with this because so much blame was put on women, and there was so much sexual shaming of girls and women within purity culture. And so I think, first of all, the church has just got to get, True Love Waits that Southern Baptists came out with was sort of the beginning of all this. And then it's just kind of gotten worse from there. And it always kind of creeped me out. Even though I'd gotten outside of all that, you'd hear things like about purity balls and like fathers giving their daughters rings and all that. Just, that was just creepy to me from the get-go, that this stuff got set up. And so the church got to stop that stuff. But then you have all this theology about submission, and so how do you say no to powerful men? The church won't say no to them. Look at how Southern Baptists have fought any responsibility for the sex abuse scandal among Southern Baptists. Look at how the Catholics have fought it because they're afraid of losing some money. And so every time the Southern Baptists have tried to respond, they've just mucked it up worse. And my friend Krista Brown has a new book coming out. You have to get Krista on here. It's called Baptist Land, because Krista has led the fight along with a woman named Dee Miller. And they've been fighting this stuff since the 80s and 90s with Southern Baptist. And in Baptist Land, Krista writes about her journey through this and trying to get some accountability for the youth pastor who abused her and then was just continually passed along. And so the church needs to listen to survivors, because Krista said early on, we need some kind of database where churches can report people who've been credibly accused. And Southern Baptists have always resisted that. And even now what they're setting up is not going to work, because they have defined credibly accused so narrowly using sort of legal markers that, and we know that most abusers are never legally culpable for abuse. And so I think the church there's so much to rethink. I could go on and on with that one. But I think the church has really got to stop thinking of women and girls as less than, as subject to, as responsible for, all those things that the church has posited as a way essentially to maintain male privilege and power.
Do you think that there's like, what are the kind of first steps for articulating a more positive framing that would, have that if the changes that took place walk down that path, the kinds of conversations as people are coming of age and having those conversations in a sacred space would hopefully minimize the number of victims and empower both the victim and the institutions to take their voices seriously.
Well, I think we've got to just start off and say that, let's treat everybody as a full human being. Let's recognize that children and women are equally of value with men, and let's recognize that sex is a good thing, but abuse is about using sex as a mechanism of power over. And so we've got to teach people not to exert power over, and particularly not to use sex to do that. And we have to empower people to report, and we have to believe them when they do. And there have to be consequences that involve some kind of responsibility for the perpetrator, that involves some kind of, if not restitution, some attempt to make things right. And none of the responsibility for that falls on the victim. This idea that a pastor who's been abusive can get up in front of the church and go, "I'm sorry, and God's forgiven me, and that is enough," has got to stop. I think at the least, perpetrators need to pay for all the counseling that victims need. I mean, that would be one place to start, that there has to be that kind of accountability, and that perpetrators need to get themselves in some serious counseling, and not this biblical counseling stuff either, this idea that you can throw a Bible verse at everything, because there are some deep-seated problems with people. And so churches need to take responsibility for making sure that church members get the help that they need, but it's not the victim's responsibility to somehow redeem the perpetrator. And that the perpetrator's got to make some kind of restitution and be accountable. So, sorry, I'm getting a little riled up here because I feel pretty strongly about these.
Oh, well, I mean, as long as you don't start throwing Bible verses, then I think we'll be.
Well, I might throw a few, but not in the ways people would probably expect.
Well, Grace, there's this in chapter, I think it's chapter 4, in God the Problem. There are a number of features that have so kind of like essentialized to the Western God concept, that y'all spend time both like naming them and trying to outline the way one, they aren't the complete picture within the tradition, but also are judging theology by its fruits. That part of what this kind of essentializing of the deity to the giant phallus in the sky, authoritarian shaped, is it takes the symbol of ultimacy at the heart of Christianity and goes, well, let me tell you what was really going on in Jesus. It's what his dad was after, as opposed to letting what was getting itself done in Jesus reorient our understanding of the divine. And as someone who has explored that wrestling with the inherited God concept in a number of different works, what are there particular features of it that, in hearing and attending to stories of survival, that need to be named so that people kind of are increasingly aware of the consequences for defending and reasserting these less than compelling and beautiful pictures of God?
Anyway, Tripp, I love the choice of your words. It's a good and important question, because I think our images of who God is, and they're just metaphors and images and words because we have not seen God. We don't know the fullness of God. God is infinite. We are finite. But there are these biblical images and metaphors of God, and it's diverse. But, with the church being led by white male theologians and bishops and popes and priests for the last 2,000 years, and then recently with, the Protestant ministers who are all men, and then for the last 70 years or so, some of us Protestant denominations where we're ordaining women, these men always read the Bible through their patriarchal lens. And whatever they read and they interpreted, it really reinforced their own power and authority in the church and in society. So of course you're going to have, and they're going to continue to use images of king, Lord, this kind of emperor view of who God is, because that's what white men did. They were colonizing vast lands around the world. They were engaging in genocide. They were engaging in war and enslavement. So they used those images of God. But we know the consequences, and it really allows these abuse to happen to the weaker, the oppressed people, and the sexual violence against women. So we really have to question first, why are we using these images of God from the Bible, and what are they serving? And are there other images of God in the Bible? And yes, there are. Now that there are feminist theologians rereading scripture and digging scripture, we're retrieving the feminine images of God. We have Hakma, we have Ruah, we have Shanika, and we have, Mother Hen, we have El Shaddai, this God of breasts. There's so many of these feminine images and languages and words and metaphors of who God is. So we need to use those too. But I know on a Sunday morning, once we use these feminine languages and words about God, people are going to be very upset. But we have to share and say it is biblical. And we have to get back to why these were not used, why they were kind of ignored. Istanbul, the big church, Hagia Sophia, that's Holy Sophia, that's holy wisdom. So there were pockets of, our church history where they retrieved the feminine image, but vast, the 2,000 years, it's been mostly the masculine logos and etc. But those, I hope all your listeners will get our book. We really unpack these metaphors and images and how damaging they are to us, how it reinforces the status quo and legitimizes violence against women. So we challenge it. So I hope people will find it helpful for them.
Yeah. So, in attempting not to end up going for 2 hours, my favorite chapter was where you were exploring how God is a survivor, and there are a number of different particular themes that you get that you raise, but about God being relational, God mothering, God being queer, being the God who accompanies, the God who overcomes, and even trolls, which that was one of those giggles the moment you turned the page. And I noticed that when you're talking about God, those are also the sections that have the most language from survivors. And it's the language of survivors who are finding the presence of the divine, even when the God picture they were handed, the institutions where they discovered the divine didn't protect them or even choose them, right, in interrogating these experiences and such. So, Susan, which one do you want to pause on? Relational, mothering, queer, accompanying, overcoming, even trolling? Because otherwise, this will turn into 2 hours pretty easily. But just this is the lure to everyone to go get the book. Who Oscar just asked what book we're talking about. It's this one, Surviving God, right there. So yeah, pick whichever one you want, but I love the chapter.
Well, why don't I talk about the God who overcomes? Because that was actually from me. Because a few years back, I had my first experience of getting seriously trolled. What happened is I had written a piece for Baptist News Global about climate change, and it got picked up by campus reform folk. And this kid wrote an article about it that got picked up by Breitbart. And what I had said in the piece was that there was a new study that came out that showed that among Christians, white Christians, both conservative and more liberal, were more likely to engage in climate science denial than other Christians. And so what I argued, and I guess it was just too complicated for, Campus Reform and Breitbart, was that as white Christians, then we had some responsibility to take on our issues around climate science denial, because of course we know that climate change most affects vulnerable populations, particularly people of color in the 2/3 world. Well, that got distilled into headlines that said, Oregon State professor says white Christians cause climate change. And all of a sudden, the stuff I started getting, and I included that as sexual abuse because it was gendered and sexualized. And so they called me every ugly gendered name in the book, every insult around lesbian identities. I mean, the whole bit, to the point where I was actually a little worried about how bad it would get. The university, offered me protection if I needed to come on campus, that kind of thing. But what happened in the midst of all that, so what started out as this horrible, horrible thing led to suddenly, as people learned about it, people getting in touch from me from my years and years of teaching to support me. People who theologically maybe disagreed with me getting in touch and saying, this isn't right. And suddenly I had like one of the most affirming days of my career with people saying really nice things to me. And so what I go back to the story of Joseph and say, what they meant for evil actually, turned out to be a really good thing. And for me, that is God present in my suffering and overcoming it. Because at the end of the day, my fear gave way to this incredible sense of affirmation and support that I was doing the right things. And so that image is a powerful one for me. So their abusive behavior was overcome by the good of people who got in touch and said kind things.
Well, it seems to me that you did something rather wild. You thought when reading a study where it says that a particular demographic, all of whom would have confessed Jesus Christ as Lord before their baptism, and you thought to yourself, so if the consequences of your action have negative effects towards the least of these, and the person you pledged lordship to said how you treat the least of these is how you treat me, that perhaps you should raise the question, because they might want to know that they're not, they might be, through a bit of ignorance, intentional or not, harming their deepest, most cherished commitments. So you thought an invitation to deliberate discipleship might be worth noting. And I'm amazed how confident you were that might work.
Are foolish. I mean, there is some part of me that I don't know. It's like, Adrienne Rich says in one of her poems, the fact of a door frame means I have something to hold on to while I beat my head against the wall. I've always resonated with that poem. So, yeah, you would think, but no, but I can't stop it either. There's something in me that's just compelled to keep saying these things, even if I get trolled, which has happened again since then, but not as bad. I was not afraid.
Yeah. The one of the things that I think often gets overlooked in this conversation is how like there are these structural problems, there are these conceptual problems that lock in a power dynamic, but they also infect the way you tend to those who are survivors. And that's one example of it, that the overcoming was actually it getting so intense, people you wouldn't have anticipated go like, well, this is wrong. But I wonder if part of it is the way in which we have so narrowed the proclamation of the gospel in American Christianity, especially Protestantism, to the individual. And then it's the individual who is the violator or the sinner, that in and of itself becomes the script you hand victim and violator alike, the survivor and the one who did the violence. If all you have is a story about the individual being forgiven, then forgiveness, the prayer to be forgiven for how you were harmed, is now the divine sanctioning of shame. And I wonder if that's how I know that, like, that's like the inverted side, right, of the Han question you raised at the beginning, Grace. How would you describe the need to expand the picture of salvation so that the fullness of humanity and our experiences have a place within it?
Yeah, Tripp, you're so insightful in all your questions. I'm trying to follow all your thoughts. I think Brian McLaren said it well when he said, Christianity is not this evacuation plan to go to heaven. But I think, when I was growing up, that's what it was. And many Protestant churches or evangelical churches may have that. So what happens here on earth isn't that important. So if you suffer, if you are experiencing sexual violence, it doesn't matter, because just persevere. And when you get to heaven, you're going to get rewarded with all these great crowns of whatever it is. So with that kind of theology, we really forget that the creation story, where in Genesis, God created and it was good. God created the world and it was beautiful. It was good. The water was good. The trees were good. Human beings were good. We are all valuable and good. We have to move away from this dualistic framework where our body is bad and our spirit is good. We have to look at everything holistically, that God created, yes, my body, my mind, my spirit, and everything is good. So if one part is damaged, we need to think about salvation widely. It's not this evacuation plan, but it is to really save those who are experiencing abuse. And because Susan talked about climate change earlier, it is really, salvation is to save this planet from destruction. Our narrow perspective of salvation has done so much harm. And I want really all of us to think about what salvation means during Lent, during the time of Easter and after Easter. What does it mean to be saved? And I think when women and young girls are experiencing sexual violence, as well as young boys and men, there is an ugliness. It's a sin. It goes against your body, which is God's creation. And this notion of this quick forgiveness and then they're let go, Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace. We have to really look at this large picture and see what is happening to the victim and really take care of the victim. Because our book is called Surviving God. And as Tripp, you said, we included other stories of survivors. There's many that didn't survive. And so, what are we going to do about people who do not survive this violence against their body? It's a huge problem, and our book doesn't solve all problem, the whole entire problem, but at least it attempts us to go on this journey together to really tackle what are these things that are contributing to this sexual violence and how we can move away from this. So thanks, Trip.
All right. So we got time for one more question. And maybe y'all can just talk to each other about this one. What kind of, how could you see people using this book, both individually and possibly like in a group? Because so many stories are in it. It makes you want to share yours and have the experience of being heard like so many of the people in it. So if y'all had thoughts about what it would be like to use this text, either an individual processing it or in a group.
Yeah, I think that having church groups read this together would be fantastic. I think that, groups of survivors would do well. Also, people in the church who are interested in actually helping the church change to do a better job could do this. I think that, that they may want to make sure if there's some people or some resources that can help people as they do this, because, this stuff can be re-traumatizing to think about. And so I think having those resources available would be an important part of that collective journey. But we would love to see it used in churches, and we'd love to see it used in seminaries and in colleges and religion departments and anywhere where both survivors and church leaders live and could use this to make a difference. And maybe Grace can talk to them about the individual as well, so I don't take up all the time.
Well, Trip, it's always this question, after you read a book, are people going to read it? That's the biggest thing. You spend so much time writing it. When I wrote that Homebrewed Christianity book for you in your book series, it was a tiny book. But I had to rewrite that, I think, at least once, because they said I did it all wrong and I had to rewrite it. So even that tiny book, I spent so much time writing that and rewriting it. And I was almost to the point, Trip, I can't remember if I was just going to get out of that whole series because it was just like too much revision going on. But anyway, for every book, there's just so much work. It's endless work. And so I always ask myself, are people going to read it? And I'm always hoping that people will read it, whether they have been sexually abused, that they will read it. But there's a lot of people out there who want to know more about this issue. The whole book is not just on sexual abuse. There's a whole thing about who God is and, who Jesus is and what happened the night of his arrest. There's chapter on joy. There's a lot in the book. So I'm hoping that, as Susan mentioned, churches will use it, and also seminary classes will use it in the pastoral department, in the theology department, in the biblical department, because we're rereading many of these scriptural passages. So I hope individuals and study groups and church groups and seminaries and just even those not even of our Christian faith will pick it up, because, this is not just happening in the churches, it's happening everywhere. Our lens is a Christian lens, but because we are approaching it with intersectional lenses, that people outside the church, and especially those who left the church, will read it. So I'm hoping that there will be a wide audience, that people will be interested. And I hope that the churches that are really dealing with it head on right now, the Catholic Church and many of the Protestant churches, where the denomination itself or individual churches are dealing with this enormous problem, will take a stab at reading this and maybe changing their thoughts, their ideas, and theology. So, Trip, I really hope that your listeners will read it. It's always my hope that, because it's such a long process, so many hours of writing and then rewriting and then changing everything and rewriting it again, that I hope that many of your listeners on Homebrewed will read it too. So thank you so much, Trip.
Oh, no problem. This has been a blast, everybody. Here's the book, Surviving God. Thank you, Susan and Grace. And I'm going to look forward to, when y'all three-peat as tag team authors.
We are going to three-peat.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've already signed the contract.
I know we signed the contract. We can't back out now.
What's the, y'all have a title?
Well, this is a Rutledge book. It's part of a series they have called The Basics. And so it's like Marxism, The Basics, or, biblical criticism, The Basics. So we're doing feminist theologies, The Basics.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So in a few years, we'll see you again, Trip.
Well, I hope it won't be that long. Well, maybe we can talk Susan into coming to beer camp and hanging out with us.
I would do that. I would do that.
Actually, it's close by to Susan too. So we'll be, so I can't wait to see you and many listeners at Homebrew Christianity Beer Camp. Trip, I'm so glad last year, because I don't drink much beer. Well, I rarely drink beer. So I'm so glad you had the non-alcoholic drinks there.
Well, hopefully this year you won't come injured. We're not going to.
Please pray that I will not come injured, and because I do have some travel in between, I cannot fall again and come with what did I have? Crutches? Yeah.
Well, and a big boot.
Yeah. Well, it was a big leg brace.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was horrible, Trip. It was only like a few weeks after I fell and I broke my knee that I was there at beer camp. I cannot believe I came, and everybody at beer camp said, "I cannot believe you came too." So,
well, it'd be easier for you to socialize this year if you're, able to walk around without pain.
And not have to rest. I was really exhausted. I couldn't do much. So this time I will be able to socialize more and maybe stay up. Last year I couldn't even stay up. Once you break something in your body, I was a mess.
The month before it, I take a whole lot less risks, just because it would be like a year of depression if I didn't get to go have fun at beer camp.
Well, you're the whole conductor, orchestrator. You are it, so you cannot be injured. If you are injured, it won't happen. So you got to take it easy this year.
Well, the church this year is it's at St. Andrew United Methodist in Denver, which is the largest open and affirming Methodist church, and so it's a lot more. It has a lot more space, so we're going to be able to have more stages and things. But we're also going to have artists this time. They're going to do kind of breakout areas for people to try different kind of spiritual practices or kind of art-based reflections. Grace, there was one of my favorite Asian feminist theologians that said, have you considered if people coming to beer camp don't want to day drink and do theology for 8 hours, maybe just 2? And that was your tactful way of have you thought about if everyone's not just like you, that they might have other experiences they want.
Yeah. That's good, Trip. You are listening to me.
I know.
And this is not beer. This is sparkling water. Just an FYI.
That's what I need. Yeah. So that's good, Trip. I am so excited because the nerding out for 8-10 hours, or you guys do sometimes 15 I can't handle it. I could just do 2 hours and then I'm done. Some of your podcasts that go on over 2 hours, I don't know how people do it. Well, so I'm always telling Trip, we got to go short.
I know. Well, I think people just come back to it, or they're like me and listen at 2.5 speed the podcast. I have an app that turns the speed up, and over time I got really good at listening to audio fast. It's like speed reading for your ears.
Well, anyway, I'm really excited about it because you put on this extraordinary event. So for those listeners who haven't been there, it is extraordinary because you're not going to get something like that anywhere. Like I've been to tons of these meetings and conventions or these. Yours is very, very different, and there's so much that you're offering. So I'm glad you're listening to me and that you're going to offer even more things. So yeah, I'm hoping that there'll be a big crowd. There was a big crowd last year, which was great. So,
yeah, we have it. I'm going to send the email about it tomorrow, I think, but just the people that are on the waiting list, there's already like 120 some people registered for October. So,
that's amazing. After this podcast, you'll get another 100. Just use a bit of this last segment to promote the beer.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm excited about it. And did I tell you that because Diana is coming and Brian's coming, Ilya Dilio's coming, John Tatominal, anyway, there's.
And I'm coming. You didn't mention me.
Well, no, I'm talking to you about it.
Oh, okay.
Because you're you. I mean, Grace, have you ever met Grace G. Sun Kim?
There's so many dimensions of me, not all of them. Yeah, so I will meet her there at the beer camp.
You're going to meet her.
The beer side of me. You know what? You know what happened 2 years ago, right?
Susan, have you ever seen Grace after she has half of a beer?
I don't think we've ever drawn together, have we, Grace?
Well, I would suggest you do it after a day of writing, not before. But it was among the funniest. She said, "I want to try." We're setting up for beer camp, and one of the breweries made a beer called the Process Party, and it had like Alfred North Whitehead and Catherine Keller, like process theologians on the can, and I don't think she was paying attention and drank enough of it. Yeah. But by the time the podcast started, she was ready to rock.
I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know I was going. That was a big problem. And then I was suddenly on the stage, and all these lights on me. I was like, it was like. Yeah.
In one of the next morning or the next afternoon when she gave her talk at the main stage, she said, "So about last night," and it's one of those moments where you realize, man, there's no way I can start it with a zinger like that just you automatically win the room with it, Anyway.
Yeah. I love it.
Good. I will be careful next time. Well, I don't really drink, but I was just trying and sampling. And,
all things to all people. Good. You're just being biblical, Grace.
We're going to do margaritas next time we're together, Grace.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, well, if y'all are hanging out with margaritas, we can record a podcast right after y'all get done. But I won't live stream it. So if we have to edit.
Sounds good. Because Trip, I'm coming back for a few things, right? So maybe that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I have to do some things for you.
Yes. All righy.
And those listeners, I haven't had anything today, so this is me. Can you imagine if I had something?
Oh, Susan wouldn't have known what to do.
No.
She'd have been like, what?
Who's this?
It was the bubble water.
Who's my Grace?
Do you remember Dan? I forget his last name. Was sitting beside me. What was his last name?
Dan Koch.
Yeah, Dan, I'm like, I couldn't remember his name and then to move his name tag. Anyway, that was funny. And then he made a big thing about me moving his name tag so I could see his name.
No, Susan, she leaned over and grabbed his name tag and looked at it on the panel. It took me a minute to decide, like, that would be something if I thought I could get away with it, I would just lean into and perform. And I'm like, was Grace also a theater major? Because this is quality. And Adam was just laughing because Dan's like, and Adam Clark was sitting there on the other side, and he was trying not to, because Dan's face just was like. Anyway,
this is still live, right? Okay, so we better smarten up now.
Oh yeah.
It's been great to talk to you, Trip.
PhDs, very professional.
PhD, we're very
But they're also human. They're also human. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll get a margarita episode with Susan and Grayson later.
Okay.
Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you're digging it, if you enjoy it and want to make this possible for other people, then consider joining the Homebrewed community. That's right. Not only will you be a part of the people that make this happen, but you'll get the private member podcast feed, access to all sorts of goodies, and go to bed knowing I make theology possible that doesn't suck on the interwebs. Homebrewedcommunity.com. Peace.